Well, as you may have gathered already, it's one of those afternoons here in Canberra with both the Senate and the House sitting. We were hoping to bring you a political panel which would have included Labor Senator Tony Sheldon and Liberal MP James Stephens. James Stephens is here with us. Welcome, James.
Greg.
But in welcoming you, I will explain, if you hadn't picked up the news from outside the studio, the Senate is gridlocked in divisions at the moment. If Tony Sheldon can join us, and I'm sure he's got a lot to say about Qantas, by the way, he will. In the meantime, you and I can kick off into this discussion. So Alan Joyce finishes up tomorrow. Should he get his bonuses? He's obviously paying a price already by going 2 months earlier, but is he fully entitled under the circumstances to pick up some of those payments?
Well, I suspect he's legally entitled to it, of course, and indeed I support companies making decisions about their remuneration, and they've determined that Alan Joyce has been worth that. But I think there probably are a lot of Australians that are wondering whether or not some of the elements of Qantas's behaviour over the last few months in particular has, caused some brand damage, and a lot of us are probably looking for Qantas to find some ways to show that they genuinely are the national carrier and perhaps show a bit of contrition for some of the experiences that Australians have had.
The ACCC might make that compulsory, actually, if it so rules against Qantas. It must confirm, the fact that they're investigating must confirm the suspicions that many frequent travellers, yourself included, would have held about what was seen at the time as artificially constrained capacity coming out of the pandemic, almost as if they weren't trying hard enough to put those extra flights and extra seats on. Do you think we've established that already?
Well, hopefully the investigation does. And look, my experience, I think we're all understanding in the early part of the pandemic how significantly that was affecting businesses like Qantas. And I think we all had a degree of tolerance for it taking some time to fully whir back into action. But certainly I think in the last few months, my experience anecdotally, as you can imagine, am a relatively regular flyer, has been that their service certainly hasn't been anywhere near what it was before the pandemic, and I think there has been enough time for them to be back to normal, so I think they do have some questions to answer. All
right, on an associated matter, your side of Parliament has asked plenty of questions so far this week, and there's more days to come, about the Qatar Airways decision. What's to stop that airline, though, going ahead in states like your own and taking almost unfettered flight access into an airport like Adelaide? Should that happen? Are you doing anything as an MP to encourage that to happen, regardless of what you think about the original decision to do with the major airports?
Well, I'd certainly love them to, because Qantas don't service internationally out of Adelaide at all. And yes, Qatar are one of the most consistent and reliable services of international routes out of Adelaide. And we all know how vital that is for connecting community, but also getting export to market sources. So I absolutely encourage Qatar to commit to the Adelaide route even further than they have, but I suppose you could be forgiven for understanding why Qatar's just perhaps a little bit nervous about what their future is in Australia, given the experience they've had recently with the government.
So would you have preferred that approval had been given to those 21 extra weekly flights by the Albanese government? I ask that because presumably if it had been, the chances of an Adelaide or a Perth or even here in Canberra airport internationally ramping up with Qatar would be greatly diminished, wouldn't it?
Look, absent of any information that is in the public domain, I certainly wish those had been approved, because I just want to see more competition, more supply. I want costs on the average Australians' travel bills to be reduced as much as possible, and more flights will achieve that. I'm more than happy for my hometown, for Adelaide, to be competing like everyone else does, and I think that we just want as much competition in the marketplace as possible, including those extra flights from Qatar.
All right. Why don't we move on to industrial relations? Again, I remind the audience, in the absence of Tony Sheldon, who I'm sure would have held really strong views about the loophole legislation that has already been introduced into the Parliament this week. The Minerals Council of Australia says the nation's ongoing prosperity is under assault from this, and that the latest industrial relations changes are some of the most extreme interventionist workplace changes ever proposed in Australia. That can't absolutely ring true, can it, James Stephens, compared to work choices?
Well, we saw the legislation tabled yesterday, and if I'm honest, I and the team are still fully digesting what's in it. And I respect the Minerals Council, and I think some of the early signs are pretty concerning. I mean, there are some significant changes and expansions to the rights of unions, particularly around workplace access that, of course, are probably unfortunately not a surprise. We always expected Labor to get into this, repaying the union movement for the enormous amount of financial support they gave them to get into power. This is them paying the piper, but the victims will be productivity in our economy and unfortunately potentially job losses associated with
Tony
that.
Burke points out a small number. He's targeting really through this legislation a small minority of employers who make use of these loopholes. Well, there's few elements to it, but particularly the labour hire elements of it. If that's true, then most employers wouldn't have anything to fear, would they?
Well, if that's true, they wouldn't, and I think that probably means it isn't true because they absolutely are fearing it. And there are other elements too around the way in which casuals are treated and converted into permanency. Like I say, there's a lot of expanded union rights in this legislation, and we're very concerned and regrettably, though not surprised, this has been on Labor's agenda. It's what happens when Labor governments get elected. They come after the employers and they seek to expand the power of unions.
All right, very quick one. I might have put it to Tony Sheldon too. Just finally, no questions about Richard Marles' RAF VIP flights today. What was that? It was a one-day wonder, was it?
Well, look, you know, the questions we asked yesterday weren't answered, so I suppose we get 10 questions a day and there's a lot of other important things to get into. But, you know, look, the information on that is out there in the public domain, and it's up to the Court of Public Opinion to decide whether they think the way in which the Deputy Prime Minister has been using the taxpayers' resources is or isn't appropriate.
All right, we'll see whether your side comes back with more questions on that in subsequent days. James Stephens, thanks again for joining. Shame we couldn't bring you a combatant here today, or an interlocutor, perhaps we should say, but we'll do it again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.